Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the podcast, Atonement, the Path of Wholeness. Now in episode 1, I realize that I used a number of terms that I didn't provide definitions for. And to be more clear in what we're talking about here on the podcast, on this episode, I'm going to share the definitions for some of these terms, and then also I'm going to share about an example from my own personal life that just happened this weekend. It's very hot off the presses right here about a conflict that my wife and I had and how this deals with the idea of integration and this idea of the inner work that we can do to really experience what it means to have atonement. In addition, on this episode, just for kicks, I put last week's episode into an AI program and it generated this really cool summary. So I thought that I'll just use this summary of the last episode because frankly, the AI does a pretty dang good job of describing exactly the intent of this podcast. So I think you'll enjoy that as well. And then after we get through that summary by these two AI hosts, artificial intelligence that you'll hear, it's amazing what this can do nowadays. I'm going to talk about a real world example about how this relates to my life and a situation that just happened with my wife and I, and how I personally am applying these principles that I'm talking about here on the podcast of atonement. Now, the first definition that I want to clear up here on the podcast is when I use the word perfect. And the reason I want to clear this up is because what I find is that the way that we use this word in modern language, the way that we use this and define this word perfect is different than a way it was used in the past. Typically, when we use the word perfect today, we mean something without flaw. So when it comes to our own actions, when we say that we need to be perfect, oftentimes what we're actually hinting at is some form of perfectionism, where we're trying to cling to some intellectual idea of what the right thing is. So on this podcast, when I talk about the idea that the purpose is not to be perfect, I'm not referring to the fact that we're not trying to constantly improve. We're not seeking to better ourselves. No, that's not what we mean at all. What we mean is that there is a standard that our parents, that society sometimes puts on us and that sometimes we adopt, that there's some idealized human being that we're supposed to be. Now, this is the key distinction here, right? It's one thing to try to live up to a standard of perfection in a very loose and natural way. Like I said, just trying to improve ourselves, constantly looking for our flaws, repenting daily. And it's very different to cling to the idea of perfection and go into guilt and shame when we don't measure up. And also to think that the way to get to heaven or the way to please God is to act flawlessly. Like this goes against the whole entire idea of the atonement. The whole idea behind the atonement in a religious context and sense was that Jesus Christ, this perfect exemplar, atoned for our sins because we couldn't do ourselves. As a matter of fact, I want to share with you a quick story. I was at a business roundtable recently, and I was talking with a very successful entrepreneur. And the reason I bring up this story is because it's not the only time that I've heard this said. I've heard at least 3 different men, powerful men who are running multi-million-dollar businesses, who are smart, who have excellent relationships with their wives, they have children, they're family men, they're all around great human beings. And they've all in different circumstances said some way, shape, or form the following thing to me, that when I tell them I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they look at me and they say, and we get talking about some of the cultural shame that's embedded in the church and this idea of religiosity and things like that, and my own experience and my spiritual path. And they say, yeah, I mean, I know a lot of guys who are very, very messed up, who are or were formerly members of the church. And they, from their outside perspective, they attribute the church. They say, well, it's the church and the teachings that cause this. As a matter of fact, I asked one of these guys, I said, hey, well, help me understand from your perspective, like from you looking outside in, what do you think it is about the frameworks and the teachings in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, either culturally or institutionally? What do you think it is about the teachings that causes you to see the trauma being induced in these men that you know of, your friends and people that you've associated with? And he thought about it for a minute. As a matter of fact, he got back to me the next day. He said, Enoch, that was a really good question, and I wasn't quite sure how to answer it, but after I've thought about it overnight, this is what I think. He says, the church and the teachings, and I'm paraphrasing what he said. He said, the teachings set up an impossible standard of what it means to be a man. And so as a result, people always feel like they're falling short. Okay? So when we talk about this idea of perfection, that's not so when I say that the goal is not to be perfect, that's what I'm referring to. It's not the goal of life, and the whole reason this podcast, one of the big reasons this podcast is here, is like to debunk the myth, the painful myth that's causing so much trauma right now, unknown, invisible trauma in the lives of men, in the lives of women, in the lives of children, that there's some idealized standard of perfection that you're supposed to live up to, and that the way to get there is by doing particular actions, as opposed to, as we learn in the Book of Mormon, purifying the inner vessel. That's what this podcast is about. It's about taking this idea of repentance or atonement or purification and saying, okay, what does that actually mean? And how does that actually apply to our lives? Not just in a spiritual sense, but how does it relate to our relationship with our wives, with our kids, with our team members, in our businesses, in our finances, in our communities, and in our church membership, as well as our spirituality? So to summarize, when I use the word perfection on this podcast, I use the modern definition of perfection that suggests that something is supposed to be perfect, without flaws, without mistakes. And the idea, the false idea, that this is the standard by which God judges us, and this is the standard by which we need to judge, or we should judge other people. Because again, if that's the case, then we're all doomed, because no one on earth besides Jesus Christ was ever perfect. Now, we take a different interpretation of the word perfect here, the way it was used in some of the old scriptures. We've referenced the idea of perfect being more similar to the idea of whole, which is the whole idea of this podcast, the idea of integration. Another phrase that I used on episode number 1 and that I'll constantly use here is standing in your divinity, or standing in your divine essence. Now, what this means is that there is a part of you, there's a godly essence that you are. And this godly essence was the power that allowed Jesus to do miracles. This was the power that allowed the visionaries to see visions and to bring forth inventions and revelations. And that you and I, we have this inner divinity in ourselves as well. It's the godly part of us. It's the part that brings all the powerful, amazing attributes that we saw exemplified, we saw given an example of in the life of Jesus Christ. So when I talk about standing in your divinity, I mean not just going down some spiritual path of religiosity, but I'm referring to a deep inner knowing, a realization, a lived experience of a daily communion with God. That as a soul walking on this earth, as a human mortal walking on this earth, that you're very, very connected to the spiritual side of life. And because of that, you're able to do things like manifest things in this material world. You're able to use that creative power to co-create with God to create things here on earth. So with that, let's jump into this review of the podcast that was done by a couple of artificial intelligence speakers, and they do a pretty good job of describing and explaining more in depth some of the terms that I use and that we're talking about here that are so important on the podcast. Things like what it means to be disintegrated, what it means to have a shadow, what it means to integrate that shadow. These are typically words that a lot of times people in the psychology field use, and one of the purposes of this podcast is to bring them down so everyday people like myself and you, we can all understand this. We can figure out how they apply to your production in life in the terms of you having a better relationship, you making more money, you having a bigger impact in your life, and having better connections with the people around you. So with that, let's roll into this review of episode 1, where they're going to go in depth to this idea of how do we integrate? What does this mean? Why is it so important, not just to our spiritual growth, but how do we bring the spiritual side of life together with the worldly side to stand, as I mentioned, in your divinity?
All right, get ready, because today's deep dive, it's a bit of a wild one. Yeah. We're talking about a podcast that claims it can help you unlock financial abundance.
Oh, okay.
Like really improve your relationships.
That's right.
And even, wait for it, have a better sex life.
No, okay.
All by exploring this idea of atonement.
Huh. That's not your usual self-help advice?
Definitely not something you see every day, right?
Yeah.
Good.
It's called Atonement, the path of wholeness and total integration. And I know that sounds a little bit intense, right?
Yeah.
A little bit like a textbook or something. But I think what we're going to find in this podcast is anything but try.
Oh, absolutely. And Sears is so good at like making this stuff accessible, you know?
Yeah.
He's got this really unique way of taking this idea of atonement and really aiming it at men who are looking to connect, you know, their spiritual lives with their everyday lives, you know, getting better results in relationships, having more success at work, just that kind of thing.
Yeah, and he really starts out with this bold statement that a lot of us, maybe even people who consider themselves spiritual or religious, are actually living what he calls disintegrated lives. Have you ever felt that? Like that you're being pulled in a million different directions, like different parts of you are kind of at war with each other.
Yeah, all the time.
That's what he's talking about.
Interesting.
And we're going to break down the key insights, see if we can spark some aha moments.
Sounds good.
Now, this is the first episode of the podcast, and he calls this whole thing, get this, a journey into practical mysticism.
Practical mysticism.
Yeah. It's like, have you ever had like a spiritual insight?
Right.
And it actually helps you solve a real world problem.
Oh, yeah. I get that.
That's kind of what we're talking about here, blending those two worlds. Right off the bat, he kind of shakes things up.
How so?
He challenges that whole traditional idea of atonement, you know, the repenting for your sins thing.
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean.
He reframes atonement as, well, integrating all the seemingly opposite forces inside us.
All the opposites.
Yeah, the good, the bad, the light, and even the shadow.
Interesting.
So to illustrate this, he uses this concept of duality.
Okay.
He argues that to like really experience light, you need to understand darkness, you know, and to appreciate sweetness, well, you need to have tasted bitterness.
I see. So they kind of work together.
Yeah, like two sides of the same coin.
I was just thinking about the yin-yang symbol, you know.
Perfect example.
The light and dark swirling together.
And he doesn't just keep this concept like theoretical. He applies this principle of duality and integration directly to our lives.
What do you mean?
He's saying that instead of fighting or denying those, let's say, darker parts of ourselves, we should actually try to integrate them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a big shift in perspective. He encourages us to see those so-called negative aspects.
Like what?
Things like anger, sadness, fear, as valuable parts of who we are.
Okay, but how do we go from seeing those parts as the enemy to, you know, embracing them?
And that leads to another big takeaway, radical honesty.
Radical honesty.
Now get this, he even applies this to, well, sexuality.
Ooh.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from it at all.
Interesting.
He even goes so far as to call sex, and I'm quoting here, one of the most powerful, life-giving, and energy-giving faculties you have as a divine soul on this earth.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but it shows you how much he believes sexuality is a part of, you know, our wholeness.
Right, not something to be ashamed of.
And he links this back to atonement, suggesting that integrating our sexuality is essential for a truly fulfilling life.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, he talks about how suppressing our sexual energy can actually lead to unhealthy expressions and even destructive behaviors.
I see, so it's got to go somewhere.
It's like trying to squeeze one of those, you know, those little water balloons.
Yeah, the ones you always end up getting soaked with.
Exactly. And it shows how trying to control these natural impulses can backfire.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
Well, he seems to be advocating for open and honest communication with our partners.
Open communication, got it.
Creating a space where sexuality can be explored and expressed in a healthy way.
Makes sense.
He even encourages us to be honest about our desires, even if they seem, you know, unconventional.
To ditch those societal expectations.
Exactly. It's about breaking free from those limitations and experiencing genuine pleasure and intimacy. Now, this is where his message gets really targeted.
In what way?
He believes this is especially important for men in today's world.
Okay.
He even issues a call to action, urging men to, like, wake up and step into their, get this, divine masculine.
Divine masculine. That sounds pretty intense.
It does, right? What does he even mean by that?
Well, he's calling for men to be leaders, but not in that, you know, domineering alpha male way.
I see.
He's talking about leading through service and compassion.
More of a gentle strength.
Exactly. And he challenges men to be honest about what they truly want. to break free from those societal expectations.
And embrace their full potential.
It sounds empowering.
It is, but he also gets real about what happens when men don't do this inner work.
Uh-oh, what happens?
He says they can end up feeling lost, unfulfilled, disconnected, even if they're outwardly successful.
Wow, that's heavy.
He even talks about sexless marriages.
Really?
Suggesting it's often a symptom of men suppressing their sexuality and not communicating their needs.
That's a tough reality check.
It makes you wonder how many men are out there feeling that way, you know?
Yeah, silently suffering.
Because they haven't learned how to integrate these shadow sides.
It's a powerful question.
It highlights why it's so important to have open and honest conversations about these topics.
To break the taboo.
And create a space where men can feel safe to express their full selves.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense. But then he brings in this whole idea of nice guys.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
He quotes Dr. Robert Glover's book, No More Mr. Nice Guy.
Okay.
Which says, and I'm quoting directly here, the nicer the guy, the darker the sexual secrets.
Whoa. Okay, that's a pretty loaded statement.
It is.
But I think I see where this is going.
What do you think? What do you think he's getting at?
I think what he's saying is that men in particular are often taught to kind of repress their sexuality.
Exactly.
You know, to be nice.
Yeah, to be nice.
To not express certain desires, certain emotions.
Right.
And, you know, that can lead to a lot of shame.
Exactly.
And potentially even some harmful behaviors.
Yeah, down the line.
Down the line, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and he uses this metaphor of a water balloon.
Oh, yeah.
Like imagine squeezing one side of a water balloon. What happens? It bulges out on the other side,
yeah,
right?
Right.
So he's saying that we do that with ourselves, with different parts of ourselves. We try to suppress things, push them down.
Right.
But they always find a way to kind of like pop out somewhere else.
Yeah.
Often in ways that are not so healthy.
Not so healthy.
Yeah, and he says, what you resist persists.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Right.
The more you push it down, the more it's going to pop back up.
Yeah, yeah.
With even more force.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this point, you know, he even shares the story from his own childhood about being told to, you know, suppress negative emotions.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that part about smile that frown away?
Ugh, I hate that.
Yeah.
It makes me cringe.
It's the opposite of atonement. It's
Okay.
denying a part of who he is.
Right.
Instead of accepting it and integrating it.
Exactly.
I mean, how many of us have gotten similar messages in our lives, right?
Oh, I'm sure we all have.
What parts of ourselves have we learned to hide?
Totally.
To deny?
Yeah.
And this is what leads him to focus on sexuality, as you know.
Yeah.
Like a prime example of something that needs to be integrated.
Such a good point, right?
He's saying this is a natural human drive.
Yes.
But it's so often treated with shame and secrecy, especially in religious circles.
Oh, my gosh, yes. Especially there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings us to that story about the near-death experience.
Oh, yeah.
The one where the man is confessing to Jesus about thinking about breasts.
Right.
And Jesus just laughs.
He just laughs.
I mean, it's so good.
It's such a perfect illustration. It really is.
Of a more accepting,
right.
less judgmental view of human nature.
Yeah, it's like, come on.
Right.
We're all human.
It's challenging that traditional view.
Yeah.
And encouraging this more holistic approach.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful reminder to approach ourselves and others with more compassion and acceptance.
Absolutely.
And maybe even a little bit of humor.
A little humor never hurts.
Yeah, right?
That's where the atonement comes in.
The idea of atonement comes in. Yeah, and not just in the traditional sense of like, you know, religious rituals or asking for forgiveness or whatever.
Right.
But this really powerful idea of bringing opposing forces into harmony, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Exactly. And recognizing that all these different parts, even the parts that we might think of as like shadowy or negative, they're actually essential pieces of the whole. You know?
Yeah.
And it's when we can bring all those pieces together.
Integrate them.
Integrate them, Bring them into the light.
Yeah.
That's when we experience wholeness. Yeah.
So I think that's a great takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
You know, atonement isn't about striving for some impossible standard of perfection.
Nope.
It's about embracing our wholeness.
Yeah.
Including our imperfection.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're all works in progress.
We are.
Right.
Always a work in progress.
And I think that's actually pretty liberating, you know?
It is.
It takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
And allows us to just approach this process with curiosity.
Curiosity.
A sense of adventure.
Exactly. This is getting pretty deep.
But he doesn't stop there. He talks about how integrating our shadow side can show up in other areas too.
Like what?
Our careers, our finances.
So this isn't just about feeling good. It's about tangible results.
It seems that way, yeah. He makes a connection between our inner state and our outer success.
Interesting.
He argues that if we're at war with ourselves internally, that conflict is going to spill over into our work and relationships.
So it's like within, so without.
He even talks about business teams.
Oh, yeah. He's got this whole thing about how a team that lacks this sense of atonement, of integration, it's going to be full of conflict. It's going to be inefficient. There's going to be resentment. But when a team is in sync, when there's harmony, that's when they can really achieve amazing things.
Yeah.
They become greater than the sum of their parts.
Exactly. And it all comes back to his definition of atonement.
Bringing those opposite forces into harmony.
So it's not about being a good person or following rules.
It's about something deeper.
Tapping into a power that comes from embracing our wholeness.
I like that.
That's where things get really interesting. He brings up this idea he calls, wait for it, the curse of comfort.
The curse of comfort.
Which he says is especially relevant for those of us who are living, well, relatively comfortable lives.
Wait, so having a comfortable life is a bad thing now?
Well, not exactly, but he suggests that hardship, even though it's painful, can actually be like a catalyst for growth.
I can see that.
Like it forces us to dig deep and find strength we didn't know we had. So maybe those perfectly curated Instagram lives, you know?
Right.
Maybe they're not the whole picture.
Maybe a little struggle is good for us.
That's a great point. It's like he's advocating for a more authentic experience, one that embraces all those emotions, even the messy ones.
Okay. Well, this is where he really starts to connect the dots between integration and achieving real results in life.
Right.
He says that one of the biggest obstacles for people who are outwardly successful is that they tend to become complacent.
Okay.
They reach a certain level of comfort, and then they start pushing themselves. They stop growing.
So the curse is that comfort can lead to stagnation.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he believes that it's actually during those times of struggle, of discomfort, when we're forced to really confront our limitations, that's when the real growth happens.
Right.
It's in those moments that we're most likely to dig deep
Yeah.
and integrate those shadow parts of ourselves.
So the tough times, the times we usually try to avoid,
Right.
those are actually opportunities for growth.
That's what he's saying.
That's a powerful perspective shift.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we break out of that complacency?
Well, he doesn't give a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
But he really emphasizes the importance of intentionally stepping outside of our comfort zones.
Okay.
Whether it's taking on a new challenge at work, or facing a fear that we've been avoiding, or even just having those tough conversations that we've been putting off.
It's being willing to get uncomfortable.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
But it's not about like seeking out suffering or anything.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that growth happens on the other side of discomfort. And it's through those experiences that we can really integrate those parts of ourselves that we've been pushing away.
So it's not about avoiding the tough stuff.
No.
It's about leaning into it.
Yeah, and this is where his call to action for men comes in.
Okay.
You know, this idea of stepping up as leaders.
Yeah.
He believes that men especially have a responsibility to embrace this path of atonement.
Okay.
Not just for themselves.
Yeah.
But for their families, their communities, and ultimately for society as a whole.
He's really challenging that traditional model of masculinity.
Big time.
You know, where men are expected to be stoic, unemotional, always in control.
Strong, silent type.
Right. Yeah. And instead, he's advocating for...
He's advocating for a much more vulnerable, emotionally connected type of masculinity.
Okay.
One that recognizes the importance of integration.
Right.
Of embracing all aspects of who we are, including our emotions, our vulnerabilities, even our shadows.
This takes a lot of courage.
It does.
It really does. I mean, it's almost like he's saying that real strength comes from embracing our weaknesses.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And he argues that this is at the heart of true atonement.
Okay.
It's not about trying to be perfect or pretending we don't have those shadow parts.
Right.
It's about being honest with ourselves and others.
Yeah.
About owning our whole story.
So it's an ongoing process.
Oh, yeah.
This atonement thing.
It's a journey.
There's no finish line.
Not a destination.
Right. Yeah. It's about constantly striving to become more whole.
More integrated.
More integrated.
Yeah, and he believes this is a journey that we're all on, whether we realize it or not.
I don't know about you, but this concept of atonement
is
starting to feel a lot less intimidating.
I know, right?
And a lot more human.
It is. It's very human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really fascinating how Sears takes this whole concept of atonement.
Yeah.
Something that seems, kind of abstract or even religious, and he makes it relevant to anybody who wants to live a more fulfilling life.
And he does it in a way that's not, preachy or dogmatic.
Right.
He's not telling us what to believe or how to live.
Yeah.
He's just offering this, like
a framework.
A framework for understanding ourselves and the world.
Yeah, it's about asking questions.
Exactly.
More than providing answers.
I like that.
Yeah, and speaking of questions, I'm wondering how this whole idea of atonement applies to, the listener, Yeah.
Okay.
Like, what would it look like to actually embrace those shadow parts of ourselves? Or are we all just doomed to wander around lost and unfulfilled?
Thankfully, he does offer some hope.
Oh, good.
I think it starts with being willing to look at ourselves. Honestly.
Yeah.
Without judgment.
Right.
What are the parts of ourselves that we've been hiding or denying?
Yeah.
What are we afraid to let people see?
And what if those parts, the ones we've been trying so hard to push away, are actually the key to, our greatest potential?
That's what he seems to be suggesting.
Yeah.
He suggests that more and more people are waking up to their divinity and embracing their full potential.
That's encouraging.
He talks about a fork in the road, with some people clinging to old patterns of greed and control, while others are stepping into a new paradigm of consciousness and co-creation.
That's a powerful image.
It is inspiring, but the big question is, how do we actually do it?
Yeah, that's the tricky part, right? It's one thing to understand the concept,
but putting it into practice,
that's a whole other challenge. Well, he doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, but he does offer some clues.
Okay, I'm listening.
One thing he really emphasizes is awareness.
Awareness makes sense.
You can't integrate something if you don't even know it's there.
Right, exactly. He encourages us to, pay attention to those parts of ourselves we usually ignore.
The ones we try to push down.
Exactly. Notice those judgments we make, the emotions we try to suppress.
The behaviors we're not proud of.
It's about getting curious about those shadow sides.
Instead of just trying to hide them.
Yeah. He even suggests seeing those negative aspects as messengers,
Messengers.
What are they trying to tell us?
I like that.
What needs aren't being met? What wounds haven't healed?
That's a really different way of looking at it.
Instead of enemies to be defeated?
There are parts of us that need attention.
Compassion.
Much more effective than just fighting them.
Oh, yeah. Fighting just seems to make them stronger.
But if we approach them with curiosity,
with kindness,
maybe we can start to understand them, integrate them.
Become whole.
So once we're aware of these shadow aspects,
and then what?
We experiment with expressing them, but in a healthy way.
So not just letting them run wild.
No, finding constructive outlets.
Give me an example.
He talks about things like journaling, creative expression, physical activity.
Even therapy.
It's about finding what works for you.
What helps you move through those tough emotions?
Without getting stuck.
Without letting them control you.
And this is where community comes in.
Community.
He believes that surrounding ourselves with supportive people
who accept us, shadows and all,
is crucial for this whole integration process.
So having that safe space to be vulnerable.
Share our struggles without judgment.
Exactly. Having those mentors, guides, fellow travelers on this journey.
Because, let's be real, this inner work is hard. Yes. Much easier when you know you're not alone.
And remember, he believes that integrating those shadow sides unlocks this authenticity, strength, potential we never knew we had.
So it's not just about feeling better.
It's about becoming more powerful.
Having a greater impact on the world.
Exactly. He challenges us to step into our full selves.
Shadows and all.
And use that wholeness to create positive change.
That's inspiring.
It is.
It seems like his vision of atonement is about so much more than just personal growth.
It's about creating a better world for everyone.
And that's what I love about it.
By embracing our own wholeness.
Yeah.
We contribute to a collective awakening.
A shift in consciousness.
That can transform everything.
Relationships, communities, the world. I'm curious, what's resonated with you the most so far?
What's sticking with you from all this talk of atonement and integration? Honestly, for me, it's that radical honesty thing.
Yeah.
It really hit home.
I can see that.
Being truthful with ourselves and others, even when it's like uncomfortable or goes against what we're supposed to do.
It could lead to some pretty intense conversations, huh?
Oh, for sure. But I think it's also the key to being more authentic,
Really connecting with people.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
What about you? What's sticking with you?
It's this idea that those negative parts of us, the ones we try to hide, that maybe, just maybe, they hold the key to, well, our power.
Our potential, even.
Whoa, that's a real mind shift.
It is.
What if, instead of being afraid of our darkness, we embraced it?
Ooh, like that.
What if it's not a weakness, but a strength?
That's a great question.
And that leads us to, well, a final provocation. He says, and I'm quoting here, "There's a part of you that recognizes that your darkness is the key to your power."
Wow, that's heavy.
Right. It's like he's flipping the script on everything we've been taught about good and evil.
Light and darkness.
It's a provocative idea, that's for sure.
It is.
What if, instead of trying to get rid of those negative parts, we learn to integrate them?
Harness that energy.
Turn it into something positive.
It's like our shadow side isn't something to be feared,
but a source of, untapped potential.
Exactly. And when we embrace all of who we are, we unlock this level of authenticity and power we never knew we had.
It makes you wonder, what would the world look like if everyone did that?
Embraced this whole idea of atonement and integration.
What if we stopped trying to be perfect and just, we're fully ourselves?
It's a beautiful vision.
It is a world where we celebrate our differences, embrace our shadows,
And work together.
It sounds kind of utopian, I know.
It does.
But I can't help but feel hopeful when I think about it.
That's the power of this message, right?
It is.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
To step into our full potential, both individually and collectively.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into atonement,
Okay.
what's the one thing you want our listener to take away?
I'd say, don't be afraid of your darkness.
Don't be afraid of the dark.
Embrace it, integrate it, and use it to grow, to transform.
And maybe, just maybe, by doing that,
Yeah.
we can all create a more harmonious and fulfilling world.
Beautiful.
Well, there you have it. It's kind of strange when the AI says better what I wanted to say than I could say it myself. But I'm going to wrap up this episode today telling you about a quick story, something that happened to my wife and I over the weekend, to give you a bit of an idea about how these principles actually apply to a relationship, particularly my relationship with my wife. So we were headed out. It's around Halloween right now. We're headed out to the Ward Halloween party. And it was one of the chili cook-offs, right? So we had the chili, we're getting in the car, and my wife made a particular comment that triggered me. Now, it was an innocent comment. There was nothing devious about it. It's just a comment. I just got triggered. What does it mean to be triggered? It means that when she said this thing, there was a part of me that felt hurt, okay? And let me give you some examples of the situation to shed a little bit more light on this. My wife had suggested that she wanted me to do something, which wasn't a problem. So I was like, hey, that's not a problem, right? But I was asking her why she wanted me to do that thing. She didn't want to answer me. And this is what triggered me because as a logical person, a lot of times I just like to have reasons for why people do things, particularly people in my family. So when my wife tells me that she's not going to tell me the answer, what happened to me was I felt hurt inside. I felt like, there's a little side of me. There's the inner child, so to speak, that felt, kind of some old wounds of rejection coming up when people didn't care about me or people wouldn't include me. So it was an old wound that came up. Anyways, I got hurt. And in the moment, I didn't actually recognize that I got hurt. I just started getting frustrated and angry at her, right? So the frustration on my side escalated. I began to press her more and ask for a reason why she wanted me to do this thing. And of course, she just wants to get in the car and go to the Halloween party. So she starts escalating as well. Before you know it, we're both upset with each other. And I'm just completely triggered. Like, I am so angry. I'm just feeling down now. I'm down on myself because I'm thinking, man, why am I so angry? So literally, I went through that evening and then the whole entire next day just feeling just kind of angry at her, processing, waiting for these emotions to pass through me. The way that I would have handled a situation like this in the past is it wouldn't have escalated so much because I would have put on a stoic face. In other words, even though I got hurt inside, I wouldn't have expressed that to my wife. I would have just let it pass. I would have put on a smile and I would have went on with the party. Now, this is where we as men and people, we make a mistake. Because when we ignore the hurt that we have inside, we're not honoring ourselves. We're not honoring that part of ourselves that's reaching up to tell us something. So as I've gone through my work, I begin to be more aware of when I'm hurt. And I'm still at times failing miserably in being able to catch it so that I can express that and be in a place of vulnerability with my wife. So fast forward, what ended up happening is as I was processing and thinking about this experience, I just recognized there's the part of Enoch, there was this part of me that was upset with Carly, my wife, because there was an old wound there of not fitting in when I was a kid at school. You know, there's the popular kids over there, and I don't feel like I fit in with them, and I felt like an outsider, and so I just felt threatened. And even though I've moved past that in my life, this is a wound that apparently it's still there. So one of the beautiful things about marriage is that it serves as the most powerful mirror that we have, because our triggers are the things that teach. Our triggers are the things that teach. So a trigger is something, an emotional reaction, typically a negative, could be positive or negative, but in this case it was negative. I got frustrated, upset, and angry. First of all, it started with hurt, then it escalated to annoyance, then a surge of frustration, and then before you know it, I was completely angry, and I shut down. I mean, I didn't want to say anything too harsh in the moment because, you know, you can't untake back those words, but I was seething inside, and I was just feeling very, very upset. Which is funny. You look at that and you think, oh, come on, Enoch, it was such a silly thing. But this is part of giving myself space and recognizing that, hey, I got hurt. So after I moved through those emotions, on Sunday we finally got around to going on a walk after church, and we had a conversation and a talk. But between that time, I was able to sit down with myself, and I just imagined this little child. I did like this little visualization of little Enoch, you know, little Enoch, 5th or 6th grade, whenever I was having these feelings of not fitting in at school or not being part of the popular kids crowd. And I just imagined that little kid, and I imagined myself now as an adult with just this beaming, this light of halo. And I reached over to the kid, and I kind of took him in my arms, the former version of me, and I said, hey, you know what? No worries, we got you, man. I know that, you know, sometimes it feels like you're left out, but I got you. God has you. You're okay. You're safe. You're fine. And I stayed with that visualization for a bit, and then allowed feelings of love, feelings of compassion to wash over myself and over this other part of me. And then literally in my mind's eye, in this so-called visionary state, I saw this young child merge into my adult self, be healed, merge into my heart. And this is part of the process of me then integrating these shadow parts of me. So these shadow parts are often parts of vulnerabilities that I have, parts in which I'm hurt. And obviously these things, you know what, they're, like I said, they are obstacles that stand in the way of our financial production. They're obstacles that stand in the way of deeper relationships. They stand in the way of us having more connected sex with our spouses. And they're the reasons why so many men today live in sexless marriages. So when President Nelson talks about repenting daily, to me this is the applied application of that particular advice, that the only way we're going to be able to repent is if our unintegrated parts, in other words, our wounded selves, the parts of our personality that still feel threatened, that still feel insecure, that these parts are brought up into our awareness so we can recognize we actually have them, so we're not walking around thinking, oh, I'm totally secure, I'm good, I'm happy, there's nothing wrong with me, right? But actually recognizing the parts of us that do have wounds, come in, bring those up into our awareness, and then being able to just sit with the feelings, being able to sit with the idea of that wounded part of ourself, and being able to extend love, just as we would to another person, extend love to that side of ourself. And then what we'll find is, again, this is the process of atonement. It's so beautiful when we can apply it to our own selves, because that healing power of love that doesn't come from me, it doesn't come from you, it's channeled through us, from the Christ, through us. It's a gift. That is what ultimately then is able to integrate these hurt part of ourselves. So we as men are able to heal. We're able to be better leaders. We're able to lead our families better. And then, of course, what's the use if it doesn't have some sort of practical implication in our life? So with that, that's a wrap for episode 2 of this podcast, Atonement, the Path of Wholeness. Again, what I would ask you today is similar to what the review talked about earlier today, is where in your life is there a shadow side? Where in your life do you feel like there's a part of your life that isn't working the way that you want? Step into that place. Look at that. And where might there be an unintegrated part of yourself that needs to be brought to the table, that needs to be given some compassion? So you can integrate that part, and then once you integrate the inside, the outside will start to fall into place. This is Enoch reminding you, carpe diem. Until next time, and goodbye for now.